Welcome to this series of lectures where we explore the tensions between romance and reality in 19th and 20th century French literature. Previously, we have seen that romanticism is a product of its time. It inherited the revolutionary ideal of freedom and transposed it to artistic creativity by breaking the aesthetic conventions of the classical period. And it also defended emotion and subjectivity against the French Revolution's materialism. After the exile of Napoleon, the restoration of the monarchy under Louis XVIII re-established the Bourbons. From 1814 to 1830, France was governed by Louis XVIII and Charles X, both brothers to King Louis XVI, beheaded in 1793. Yet the absolute monarchy failed to regain legitimacy in a France divided between the Republicans, the Bonapartists, the monarchists who wished to return to the Ancien Régime, and the monarchists who wanted a constitutional monarch. In 1830, the possibility of a constitutional monarchy seemed what most people could agree on, or rather, it was what the protesters demanded so vehemently between the 27th and the 29th of July that they got it. King Charles X was deposed and replaced by Louis-Philippe, the Duke of Orleans, under the title Roi des Français, King of the French, and not King of France. Louis-Philippe reigned for 18 years. Then another revolution happened in 1848, and it brought the Second Republic. And only 4 years later, Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew to Emperor Bonaparte, then president, seized the power and made himself Empereur des Français. The Second Empire lasted 18 years and collapsed in 1870, after the defeat of the French in front of the Prussian army. On the 4th of September 1870, the Third Republic was proclaimed at the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. This period, from the institutional fall of the monarchy in 1830 to the first years of the Third Republic, marks the surge of a new artistic trend. Romanticism was a movement. It had its leaders, its theoreticians, and its emblematic figures. But it would be more accurate to describe realism as a trend, an aspiration, and an effect. Instead of the fancies of Romanticism, novels and paintings of the long 19th century then started to describe reality with the same honesty as the then budding photography. This is what can be noticed through the paintings of Gustave Courbet, for instance, who turned to painting scenes of daily life, even of countryside life, in Un enterrement à Ornans. Instead of the complexities of a single individual, authors of the 1830s strived to render the greater picture of a family, a profession, or even a generation. Simultaneously, in painting, the medieval ruins gave way to a desire to capture views of the city or of the countryside, while Daguerre and then Nadar endeavored to catch the exact likeness of the great men and ordinary people of their time. Writers such as Balzac, Stendhal, or Flaubert all endeavored to seize something of the world around them. Between the 1830s and the 1860s, and in parallel with the development of early photography, painters like Courbet and then the Impressionists favored movement and reality to classical grandeur. By the 1870s, the desire to transcribe reality into art took a scientific turn, as the naturalist movement wished to study the effect of heredity and social surroundings on characters of all social conditions. After the romantic endeavor to explore the limits of passion and to shatter the constraints of academic art, the desire for realism appears like a return to the mimetic function of art, rooted in the imitation of nature. In this talk, I will focus on Stendhal, Honoré de Balzac, Gustave Flaubert, and Émile Zola to show how they managed to create an impression of reality. We will see that while the realist impulse claims a radical honesty, it is in itself based on an art of illusions, and that the wish to seize material reality also at times results in the revealing of truths that transcend material contingency. The first indicator of the end of Romanticism as a movement or as the dominant trend is the shift of interest from the great and the exceptional to the common and the ordinary. To diagnose this as a counter-effect of Romanticism, I must turn back to an author of the Romantic period, Chateaubriand. Chateaubriand studied the biggest trend of his time, le mal du siècle, and described it as the fact that young people knew everything without having experienced anything, and were bored of life before having enjoyed it. Chateaubriand created the character René. René will serve as a template for the disenchanted romantic hero. He's been duplicated in the main works of Romanticism, and the original model quickly became a cliché. The young man of great talent and aspirations, crippled with a mysterious sorrow, held back in a world that does not understand him, and where he tries in vain to flourish but moves from disillusion to disillusion, is a story everyone ended up telling. In his Mémoires d'outre-tombe, Chateaubriand is very critical of the mimetic effect of René on the next generation. I quote Chateaubriand, « Une famille de René poètes et de René prosateurs a pullulé. On n'a plus entendu que des phrases lamentables et décousues. Il n'a plus été question que de vents et d'orages, que de mots inconnus livrés aux nuages et à la nuit. Il n'y a pas de Grimaud sortant du collège qui n'ait rêvé d'être le plus malheureux des hommes, de bambin qui, à 16 ans, n'ait épuisé la vie, qui ne se soit cru tourmenté par son génie, qui, dans l'abîme de ses pensées, ne se soit livré aux vagues de ses passions, qui n'ait frappé son front pâle et échevelé, et n'ait étonné les hommes stupéfaits d'un malheur dont ils ne savaient pas le nom, ni eux non plus. If René did not exist, I would not write it again. If it were possible for me to destroy it, I would destroy it. It spawned a whole family of René poets and René prose-mongers. All we hear nowadays are pitiful and disjointed phrases. The only subject is gales and storms and unknown ills moaned out of the clouds and to the night. There's not a fop who has just left college who hasn't dreamt he was the most unfortunate of men. There's not a milksop who hasn't exhausted all life has to offer by the age of 16, who hasn't believed himself tormented by his own genius, who, in the abyss of his thoughts, hasn't given himself over to the uncertainty of passions, who hasn't struck his pale and dishevelled brow and astonished mankind with a sorrow whose name neither he nor it knows. Stendhal's Le Rouge et le Noir marks a pivotal moment in French literature by revealing, to borrow René Girard's title, the Romanesque truth behind the romantic lie of René's cliché. The epigraph of Le Rouge et le Noir paradoxically roots the novel in the revolutionary era, as Stendhal quotes the Republican Danton, truth, the harsh truth, la vérité, l'âpre vérité. Instead of displacing the story in a distant space or time, Stendhal uses an ultra-contemporary setting, subtitling the novel Chronique de 1830. The novel borrows the credibility of the chronicle as a literary genre. Stendhal wished to describe the reality of his generation. At the beginning of the novel, the young Julien Sorel gets the opportunity to escape poverty thanks to his education by becoming the tutor of Monsieur de Rênal's children. But soon enough, the exposure to a new social environment gives Julien new aspirations. He does not want to be a servant and resents the social limbo in which a tutor must remain, above the domestic staff, of course, but definitely not equal to his masters and their peers. Julien's path, from his timid first step into the de Rênal household to his death, leads him to discover the hypocrisy and lies on which every social and political circle is built. Stendhal introduced a revolution in the narrative. Yes, the interiority of the main character matters, but not as the central focus. Stendhal offers a glimpse on the broader picture and how it can affect and be affected by what is barely noticeable. More than the subtle changes of the soul, he focuses on the infinitesimal details, a hand touching another hand, a look caught in a mirror, a word misunderstood, and their tremendous consequences on individuals, households, and organizations. Stendhal does give his characters psychological depth, but he does so with the purpose of telling, as Danton said, la vérité, l'âpre vérité. This motto justifies Stendhal's description of actions that would have been deemed rather immoral for the readers of his time, such as Madame de Rênal's desire for Julien, or Mathilde de la Mole's intention of seducing him. A passage in the novel could be seen as a description of Stendhal's own theory of the novel. It is precisely in this parenthesis about Mathilde de la Mole that Stendhal uses the image of the mirror. After having sarcastically explained that Mathilde is a character of fiction and that no young lady of 1830 would ever spend the night daydreaming about a forthcoming conquest, the narrative voice steps out of the novel's frame and speaks directly to the reader, explaining that the novel itself would not be blamed if it ever described something ugly or immoral. Stendhal thus writes, "Well, sir, a novel is a mirror strolling along a highway. At times it shows you the blue of the skies, at times the mud of the sides of the road. And you would accuse the man carrying the mirror on his back of being immoral. Why wouldn't you rather blame the road where the mud is, and even more, the road's inspector who did nothing to prevent water from mellowing into a quagmire? Eh, monsieur, un roman est un miroir qui se promène sur une grande route. Tantôt, il reflète à vos yeux l'azur des cieux, tantôt la fange des bourbiers de la route. Et l'homme qui porte le miroir dans sa hotte sera par vous accusé d'être immoral. Son miroir montre la fange, et vous accusez le miroir. Accusez bien plutôt le grand chemin où est le bourbier, et plus encore, l'inspecteur des routes qui laisse l'eau croupir et le bourbier se former." Stendhal is often credited for this analogy between the novel and the mirror, but Stendhal himself references the 17th century historiographer César Richard de Saint-Réal as the initial author of the analogy, thus merging the novel and the historiography as a genre. In reality, this expectation of accuracy would just mean to hold the novel at the same standards of the mimetic accuracy of other arts, but also the precision of historiography. If a painting needs to render what it depicts accurately, then so does the novel. And if a historian needs to tell of the evils of a certain period, then surely he has to. Even more crucially than the interest in details, even ugly or disgraceful details of his characters' gestures and moods, Stendhal unveils the greatest trick of Romanticism. Romanticism has insisted that each and every one of us has exquisitely sensitive and exhausted nerves that respond in a particularly original manner to love, disappointment, or even political crises. There could be an interesting survey about the number of times George Sand's characters, for instance, would faint. But Stendhal comes in and notes that everyone is the same because everyone, while pretending to be so unique, imitates a model that they refuse to acknowledge. His characters do fall in love, not because they feel that feeling, after all, they're beings of paper, but because they follow the blueprint set by other novels they have read. This is what happens to Julien Sorel and Madame de Rênal. Love is the child of novels, Stendhal writes. Novel has traced the path they had to play, shown the model to imitate, and sooner or later, although with no pleasure and even reluctantly maybe, vanity would have forced Julien to follow that model. L'amour est le fils des romans. Les romans leur auraient tracé le rôle à jouer, montré le modèle à imiter, et ce modèle, tôt ou tard, et quoique sans nul plaisir et peut-être en rechignant, la vanité eût forcé Julien à le suivre. In Mensonge romantique et vérité romanesque, René Girard notes that Le Rouge et le Noir is the main novel of its time to disclose explicitly the mechanism of mimetic desire, as Cervantes did earlier in Don Quixote. A character only loves what has been pointed as lovable. In Mensonges romantiques et vérités romanesques, René Girard notes that Le Rouge et le Noir is the main novel of its time to disclose explicitly the mechanism of mimetic desire, as Cervantes did earlier in Don Quixote. A character only loves what has been pointed as lovable, and in doing so does not really desire to possess the beloved, but to be the same as whoever indicated what to love. Julien's hesitations, mediocrity, and ultimate demise come from the fact that he is constantly carried from one model to the other. While he admires Napoleon, he is also impressed by the shrewdness of the Restoration politicians around him. The tension in the title between the black of ecclesiastical orders or formal attire and the red of military glory or high ecclesiastical rank, and between the red of passion and the black of death, indicates Julien's indecisiveness. Julien cares for Mathilde de la Mole because Julien wants to be a young aristocrat. She is an incarnation of aristocracy, and she appears to him as the woman all the young aristocrats want. Similarly, Mathilde fancies herself as a heroine of the Ancien Régime, identifying with Marguerite de Navarre so much that at the death of Julien, she wants to emulate what Marguerite de Navarre did at the death of Boniface de la Mole, Mathilde's ancestor. Hidden in a carriage, Mathilde carries the severed head of Julien into the mountains of the Jura, where she lays it to rest in an idyllic setting. Yet these events are told by a distant narrator who seems to revel in disclosing his character's imitative urges. The most realist aspect of Stendhal's work is his disclosure of the vanity of our desires. In his novels, the culminating moments of passion and turmoil are mere sketches through which the reader sees the effects of complex chains of misunderstandings and imitations. In order to create this fictitious impression of reality, Stendhal uses several illusionist tricks. The novel's subtitle, Chronique de 1830, is one of these tricks. It makes it almost overlap with the time of the novel's publication. Asterisks mask the name of a prefecture and of the mysterious king visiting Verrières. Asterisks mask the name of a prefecture and of the mysterious king who visits Verrières. The narrator pretends to protect the anonymity and privacy of real people by transposing real facts to the imaginary world of Verrières, and the trial is transposed in Besançon, where the narrator claims he never set foot. Just like in painting, reality is less a fact than an impression. Thus, realist writers became masters in the art of the trompe-l'œil. A trompe-l'œil is not a realistic painting. It is a painting that lures you into forgetting that it is actually a painting. Ultimate realism, therefore, would be nothing but the art of skillful illusion. Balzac could be presented as the master illusionist of his time. When Balzac wrote a lengthy defense of Stendhal's novel La Chartreuse de Parme in 1840, Stendhal replied, explaining how much he cared for style, for the careful craft in the construction of a sentence or the choice of an adjective, arguing that the best preparation for writing was to read a few pages of the Code Civil. Balzac too cared for the effect of realism. To the intent of making his novels look more real, he dedicated the greatest part of his work to the description of a whole universe rooted in the historical, political, and social realities of his time. He called this tremendous project La Comédie Humaine, the human comedy, an explicit allusion to Dante's Divine Comedy. The novels of La Comédie Humaine can be read independently, but are meant to be seen as a large social and historical fresco. They range from Les Chouans, published in 1829 and describing the last days of the Royalist opposition to the Republic in 1799, to ultra-contemporary scenes of the restoration of the monarchy and the ascension of the bourgeoisie as the new political elite in Les Petits Bourgeois, published posthumously in 1855. Balzac takes the reader through different scenes, scenes of military life, scenes of private life, scenes of provincial life, and many more, each time seizing the most significant trait of the milieu he explores. In order to increase the illusion of reality, Balzac creates what he calls le principe du retour. A character may have a secondary role in a novel, be the center of another one, and play an important part in a third. Just like Stendhal or Hugo, Balzac is haunted by the figure of Napoleon. In Le Colonel Chabert, published in 1832, he describes how one of Napoleon's colonels, registered as dead in the Battle of Eylau in 1807, miraculously survives by being protected by a pile of human and animal corpses, but fails to gain recognition when he comes back to Paris. His wife has liquidated his belongings and has remarried. Now that the empire has fallen, no one would risk becoming compromised by helping him. Chabert, now completely destitute, retires in an asylum. He gradually loses memory and reason, and in the bittersweet beatitude of his madness, with him dies the last hero of the imperial times. For indeed, Balzac is the creator of a new archetype, a new hero, the young social climber. We saw that Chateaubriand's René generated a whole series of dissatisfied and frustrated imitators until Stendhal's Julien Sorel. Balzac uses the same type of character, the young man at the start of his life, but shows that success, in fact, might be even worse than failure. Balzac plays on the theme of the young man going to Paris clad in his own shimmering illusions. This is how Rastignac first appears in Le Père Goriot, published in 1835, 5 years after Le Rouge et le Noir. Rastignac is the last hope of his family, impoverished aristocrats from Angoulême. He goes to Paris to study law, which would allow him to practice a dignified profession and support his mother and sisters. However, he soon realizes that his studies would lead him nowhere, for success in Paris works in mysterious and often petticoated ways. In order to succeed, Rastignac needs money and, even more importantly, the approval of women. Through the advice and introductions of the prestigious Madame de Beauséant, Rastignac finally enters the high society of Paris and discovers its beauties and its horrors. By the end of the novel, Rastignac has seen that the Parisian life is a world of lies and illusions, that the richest grandes dames hide unfathomable sorrows, and that nothing, not even the sacrificial fatherly love of Goriot, can resist in this infernal world where money and deceit reign supreme. At the end of the novel, from the burial place of Goriot in Le Père Lachaise, Rastignac looks over the hills of Paris like an emperor getting ready for battle and declares, "À nous deux maintenant." And while he succeeds and becomes one of the fiercest lions of Balzac's Paris, eventually becoming a collaborator of his mistress' husband and marrying their daughter, the rich Mademoiselle de Nucingen, in the unfinished novel Le Député d'Arcy in 1847, he only does so by becoming himself morally corrupt. Rastignac's trajectory is all the more fascinating that originally he appeared as a strong moral character. He refused the Faustian pact offered by Vautrin, the criminal mastermind of La Comédie Humaine. Rastignac eventually gives way to the almost devilish call of money. The most haunting figures of La Comédie Humaine, from its courtesans Coralie and Esther to its cruel or loving fathers like Le Père Goriot or Grandet, to its bankers and usurers Nucingen and Gobseck, are shaped by their need or desire for money as the catalyst of all desires. As far as the description of love is concerned, it remains the redeeming feeling par excellence for Balzac. Contrary to Stendhal's cynicism, Balzac accepts love in its Platonic purpose of elevating the soul, and he remains close to Dante, his model, by presenting self-sacrificial, disinterested love as a means to access transcendence and to dispel the overpowering idolatry of money. Balzac's realism goes as far as to accept the supernatural power of love. Love can break social norms, cross the borders of reason, and even, as it happens in the love story Ursule Mirouet, cross geographical distance or the border between life and death through supernatural apparitions. Balzac's talents as an illusionist only draw the eye to what goes beyond realism in his novels. Of course, in Balzac's world, each and every detail in the descriptions of a bedroom or a dress matters, but Balzac's greatest skill is to create myths, carrying on doing what he did in one of his first novels, La Dernière Fée, The Last Fairy. La Dernière Fée, ou La Nouvelle Lampe Merveilleuse, The Last Fairy, or The New Magical Lamp, was published under a pseudonym in 1823. A young man, Abel, who spent his entire life reading fairy tales with a help named Caliban and never saw the real world, is taken by the Pearl Fairy, La Fée aux Perles, to a party in an enchanted castle, where wizard and enchantresses dance together until the break of dawn. The young man is transfixed with joy, but the reader knows that the Pearl Fairy is no one but Lady Somerset, who was captivated by the young man's innocence. The intertwining references to Shakespeare and to the Arabian Nights allow the young Balzac to sketch a beautiful story of love, betrayal, and faithfulness, while still enjoying the freedom granted by fairy tales. La Dernière Fée lays out themes that remain constant in Balzac's world: illusion, enchantment, and the price of desire and will as a strength. La Peau de Chagrin, published in 1830, is one of the études philosophiques, philosophical studies, in which Balzac returns to the motif of the magic object. Raphael de Valentin acquires a donkey skin that makes all his wishes come true, but gradually shrinks. Even before Stendhal, Balzac analyzed the problem of desire as a force extraneous to the individual. But Balzac goes as far as to see desire as a supernatural cause whose effects go far beyond the grasp of humans. If the world is the stage of the human comedy, the characters are hardly ever aware of the strings that pull them. Thus, Balzac's novels create the illusion of a reality which is that the world is a stage, but at the same time focus on fundamental truths about human nature, desire, good and evil. Thus, some of Balzac's realist stories take the depth and dimension of legends or moral tales. Vautrin, for instance, appears as a Mephistophelian criminal who tries to lure Rastignac into a Faustian pact before he is caught and sent back to prison. Vautrin is inspired by the historical figure of Vidocq, a former criminal who becomes head of the Parisian police, but Balzac's genius elevates this real character into an almost supernatural genius, operating according to his own affinities and with his own moral codes, in ways that are meant to befuddle the reader as well as the other characters. Complex, at times repulsive as he may seem, Vautrin would be the best narrative alter ego to the author, making the most of the smallest situations to corroborate his lies and to reinforce the illusions he forges. Towards the end of Illusions perdues, Vautrin rescues Lucien de Rubempré from drowning and promises him fortune in exchange for his obedience. Lucien de Rubempré is a failed romantic poet who went to Paris with all his illusions and realized how insignificant he was. After causing the ruin and suicide of Coralie, Lucien relinquishes his hopes and is about to throw himself in the Charente. Vautrin tries with him what he failed to do with Rastignac. He rescues him, thus giving the failed romantic hero a new narrative chance, and in doing so teaches Lucien that the great events in history are rooted in much smaller events which constitute, so to speak, the other side of history. I quote, "There are two histories," says Vautrin, "the official one, the one that lies, the one we teach, history ad usum Delphini, then the secret history, where the real causes of events are hidden, a shameful story." Il y a deux histoires. L'histoire officielle, menteuse, qu'on enseigne, l'histoire ad usum Delphini, puis l'histoire secrète, où sont les véritables causes des événements, une histoire honteuse. Just as for Stendhal, the smallest moments of the story and the smallest gestures of the body or the mind could have the most tremendous circumstances and must be recorded, Balzac sees the small details of private life as most crucial, since they are the ones that precipitate larger events. Balzac's world, on many respects, is still an enchanted world. Balzac's final completed work, L'Envers de l'Histoire contemporaine, thus tells of a secret society that undertook the special mission of doing good. The idea of friends gathering to defend the innocent against injustice was already present in Ursule Mirouet, but in this final novel, after having extensively described the ease with which men hurt one another, Balzac turns to describing the strife of a small handful of people who will act as guardian angels to help others. This prototype of the Justice League is Balzac's last testimony. It shows that in a society so corrupt by an unbridled desire for money, the only solution for our destructive greed is a supernatural solution. The make-believe of the human comedy calls onto the reader to state a faith in the objective morality, and a hope, or at least a desire, for something more than what the world can give. After Balzac and Stendhal, and while Hugo is still alive and well, the works of Gustave Flaubert, then of his admirers and followers, the brothers Edmond et Jules de Goncourt, Maupassant or Émile Zola, take realism to a whole other level. Flaubert admired Balzac, everyone admired Balzac, but writes significantly less. Some short stories and a few novels that he keeps rewriting. Madame Bovary in 1857, or Salammbô, A Tale of the Fall of Carthage in 1862, and L'Éducation sentimentale, first in 1869, are his well-known novels. Madame Bovary might be the most famous. Just like Julien Sorel, Emma Bovary is a character of desire, and her desires are shaped and changed by the novels she reads, the people she meets, and the fashion ideas she gets from newspapers. Through her character, Flaubert managed to create a type, the type of the ridiculous provincial who wishes for a different life without appreciating what she has. And indeed, Emma's life is just what she wanted. She only appears 1 quarter into the novel as the second wife of Charles Bovary, a mediocre countryside doctor. Emma's father is a farmer, and she still has a farm girl's hands. To marry Charles means to escape the farm and to move into town, so Emma can finally become a bourgeoise. Alas, while this wish is finally granted, Emma is only content for a short while. When she and Charles are invited to a ball in a neighboring castle, she starts dreaming of romance and aristocracy. She falls an easy prey to the seductions of Rodolphe, a countryside gentleman who courts her at a fair, and just like Julien and Madame de Rênal were following the template of the love novels they were reading, she follows the template of the romances she read when she was in the convent and repeats, "I have a lover, I have a lover," as though the words, not the deed, could make the event real. But after Rodolphe, Emma falls in love with Léon, a parody of a romantic hero, while pushing Charles to accomplish a dangerous surgical operation to gain notoriety so that they could at last move to Paris. Of course, the result is disastrous. Emma runs from one desire to another into a pit of debt and adultery. And in the end of her life, after Emma's bankruptcy and suicide, the only words said at the side of her corpse are the commonplace remarks of the priest and the chemist Homais. Charles Bovary's kindness and forbearance only appears too late, when he too dies, and their daughter, Berthe, has to become a servant. The whole story is willingly underwhelming. Flaubert writes to Louise Collet to write mediocrity well, and in so doing, allow mediocrity to keep its aspect, its shape, even its words. This is truly devilish. Bien écrire le médiocre et faire qu'il garde en même temps son aspect, sa coupe, ses mots même, cela est vraiment diabolique. Diabolical etymologically. The artist's renewal of the novel will cause Madame Bovary to go under trial in 1857 for indecency, as it presents, among other gruesome scenes, an impenitent adulteress committing suicide and rotting on her deathbed. Emma's story could be a cynical warning not to give your life by following the random inspirations of novels. During the novel's trial, Flaubert's defense hovered between the fact that he was only showing reality, as Stendhal previously argued, and the fact that he was revealing the bad influence of novels. This trial was one of the most decisive events of French intellectual history in the 19th century and did create a division between the people who agreed with Flaubert's artistic principles and the people who disagreed with him. But the strongest defense of Madame Bovary is that this splendidly written story of desire, frustration, yearning for what one can't get is the most common of humanity. The aimless desires of Emma Bovary are what Pascal had described in the 17th century as the misery of man without God, running from disillusion to disillusion until the supreme disillusion of death. Madame Bovary poses the same riddle as Balzac's Human Comedy. If life is nothing but deceit and vanity, what could have sense, and why do we keep looking for sense? Flaubert was decidedly anti-Catholic, but faith, rather than religion, is at the core of some of his most striking works. La Tentation de Saint Antoine, for instance, tells of St. Anthony in the desert, harassed by lascivious or terrifying visions. Yet the book ends on an ambiguous scene. All the visions are leaving, and the saint repeats, Ô Jésus, and Miséricorde, O Jesus, mercy, as though the only answer to the emptiness of a sky without God was a desperate prayer that would force God to appear. It does seem indeed that the second half of the 19th century struggles to come to terms with a world deserted by the ideal. The story of the young man coming up to Paris is still told. We can still find it in Flaubert's Éducation sentimentale in 1869. The hero, Frédéric, too goes to Paris and falls from failure to failure, witnessing the collapse of monarchies and republics. And at the very end of the novel, reminiscing about a story that the reader never gets to know, Frédéric whispers the closing line, C'est là ce que nous avons eu de meilleur. This was the best time we've ever had. What is beautiful, youthful, inspiring could not really fit in a novel, or else it would wither. So the novel has to make do with the harsh, tedious and mediocre reality and leave the ideal as a fleeting end line. This brings us to address naturalism and its paradoxes. Naturalism aimed to instill scientific accuracy in the descriptions of reality. Zola borrows Stendhal's mirror to make it show not just the mud of the road, but also the flowing blood and pus of the morgue. Zola enunciated the principles of naturalism by stating that the novel should not only be the concurrent to the Code civil or l'état civil, as Balzac wanted it to be, but should be a real scientific study. In Les Rougon-Macquart, Zola takes back Balzac's enterprise of a colossal work following characters and their families across several generations. Zola does it with the scientific accuracy of a genealogist, focusing on heredity. He would follow how certain traits, such as madness or alcoholism, could move from one generation to another, be affected by a character's life choices, but also skip a generation. Zola's novels echo the most recent works of his time on heredity, hysteria, atavism, and hygiene. Zola also documented his work on the working class by extensive fieldwork, studying alcoholism for L'Assommoir in 1877 or the reality of the mines for Germinal in 1885. Zola had a clear political objective that makes him the heir of Victor Hugo. He aimed to free the working class from the tyranny of the capitalists, of religious orders, and even of diseases. The final volume of Les Rougon-Macquart, Le Docteur Pascal, offers a towering overview over 5 generations through which the reader gets to see who survived and how. The final deaths recorded through madness and even spontaneous combustion due to alcoholism seem to summarize the greatest perils described through the previous volumes. Yet one aspect of Les Rougon-Macquart is often overlooked. Its scientific accuracy is intertwined with a literary symbolism that is still heavily indebted to medieval and Christian tradition. Of course, Zola stood vehemently against the Catholic Church, especially against the injunction to the celibacy for priests. From La Faute de l'Abbé Mouret, published in 1875, to Les Trois Villes, his later trilogy, published between 1893 and 1898. La Faute de l'Abbé Mouret explores the union between the erotic and the mystical, as the young priest Serge fails to answer the call for natural love when Albine, a fairy-like young woman, cures him from a nervous crisis. The couple discover a pristine innocence in a garden called Le Paradou, the Paradise, and the whole nature seems to push them towards one another. I quote Zola, "It was the garden that had wanted the fault. For weeks it had lended itself to the slow learning of their tenderness. Then, on the last day, it drew them into the great cave. Now it became the tempter, as all of its voices were teaching love." C'était le jardin qui avait voulu la faute. Pendant des semaines, ils s'étaient prêtés au lent apprentissage de leur jeunesse. Pendant des semaines, ils s'étaient prêtés au lent apprentissage de leur tendresse. Puis, au dernier jour, il venait de les conduire dans l'alcôve verte. Maintenant, il était le tentateur, dont toutes les voix enseignaient l'amour. However, Serge abandons Albine and goes back to his priestly duties. The young woman commits suicide by surrounding herself with flowers, thus also killing the child she was bearing for Serge. Although Zola wishes to convey a materialist vision of the world, he only does so by using the rich and symbolic lexicon of Christian tradition, thus infusing his naturalism with an unexpected layer of symbolism. This can also be seen in Au Bonheur des Dames, published in 1883. Denise, young and innocent, has to go and work in a large store, un grand magasin, in the city to provide for herself and for her brothers. Although Denise has the untamable red hair that the 19th century sees as indicative of equally untamable sexual desire, she keeps such a strong integrity that she ends up not only seducing but marrying Octave Mouret, the owner of the prestigious Grand Magasin where she works. This can be seen like a conventional tale of social climbing, but the intertextuality used by Zola makes the story much more interesting than a mere rags-to-riches narrative. First, Octave Mouret is a widower, and his late wife died when she fell down the foundations of the store. This already gives Octave Mouret's enterprise something eerie and Ctonian, as though it was built on the sacrifice of a woman. The Grand Magasin, Au Bonheur des Dames, seems like a factory of sorrow and unhappiness. It plays on women's desire for beauty and fashion, ties them up by alluring offers. There is a wonderful scene that marks the historical beginning of no quibble return policy, and eventually causes endless cycles of misery. Mouret is presented as the embodiment of modern capitalism. Not only does he make the most of his female clients' money, he also enjoys his employees' desire to please him. Enters Denise, who resists him, and the truth behind the realistic narrative is suddenly unveiled through the mouth of a side character. As he said, "At least that one had her heel on the boss's neck and was avenging them all and got from him something else than promises. She had come at last, she who could get him to show some respect for the poor folk." En voilà une au moins qui mettait le pied sur la gorge du patron et qui les vengeait tous et qui savait tirer de lui autre chose que des promesses. Elle était donc venue, celle qui faisait respecter un peu les pauvres diables. The story is all the more interesting that Octave Mouret is Serge Mouret's brother. In this representation of Denise, we see her as a new representation of the Virgin Mary, with her heel on the neck of the serpent. If Albine was a figure of Eve, Denise is a Marian figure. Where Albine failed to convert the priest to a religion of carnal love and natural procreation, Denise converts the businessman to a religion of respect, loving family life, and social benevolence. Au Bonheur des Dames presents one of the rare happy endings of Les Rougon-Macquart. Denise gets a fairy tale wedding with Octave Mouret, and all is well that ends well. In his wish to attain an almost scientific social accuracy, Zola's naturalism reaches far beyond the visible world. In spite of its apparent materialism, Zola's universe errs on the verge of the immaterial, and his faith in progress is such that progress becomes a new religion. Christian hope in disguise, as can be seen in his last unfinished work, the Four Gospels, Les Quatre Évangiles, of which he only wrote 3, with very evocative titles: Fécondité, Travail, Vérité, fecundity, work, truth. Yet Zola's work is more interesting when it focuses on art itself. In L'Œuvre, published in 1886, he presents the painter Claude Lantier's endeavour to paint as realistically as possible. The book, of course, is a social sketch of Paris' artistic life at the time of Impressionism. Zola wrote it while he was a friend of Cézanne, and several of the conversations in the novel deal with the theory of Impressionism, and it wishes to seize not just the shape of the object, but the effect of the light on the object as perceived by the eye. Claude Lantier moves from failure to failure. Even the only success he gets is steeped in bitterness, as it is due to the portrait of his son on his deathbed. Eventually, Lantier gives way to his obsession for painting. He declares, Je mourrais de ne plus peindre, je préfère peindre et en mourir. I would die if I stopped painting. I would rather paint and die because of it. This death is not just the romantic death of a misunderstood artist. It is the symbolic death of a creator who has poured his entire life into a final work. Lantier hangs himself in front of his final painting, an enormous female nude, on which he works so much that the shape of the body fades into monstrous bursts of colour. What Auguste Renoir could only put to practice in 1919 in his Baigneuse is what Zola could already attempt through words by describing these outbursts of colour into volutes of light. This representation of reality thus ends up destroying life around it and even reality itself. The realistic endeavour through the 19th century offers us an insight into the period, its fashion, its words, but also its hopes and aspirations. Yet be it for Balzac and Stendhal's realism, for Flaubert's materialism, or for Zola's scientific naturalism, these authors do far more than a reporter's work. Their description of the reality of their time keeps bringing to light truths that we might refuse to see. For instance, that our desires are borrowed and imitated, or that we cannot tell any story without tapping into tales as old as time, or that art, in order to be successful, must face the risk of its own destruction. But perhaps the 19th century inevitable return to the invisible in its quest for artistic perfection or for perfect social justice is a tentative answer to the core problem of the human condition, which is that we know our finitude while we yearn for the infinite. This is what we shall consider in a forthcoming talk, where we will discuss the symbolist's endeavour to show what cannot be seen.